I never thought the people who smiled at my wedding would one day sit across from me and quietly take everything I had. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten, they didn't raise their voices or slam doors. They smiled. They used paperwork. They assumed I wouldn't understand what they were doing until it was too late, and for a while, they were right. If stories about betrayal, quiet revenge, and watching powerful people fall appeal to you, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Claire Matthews. I was married for 22 years, long enough to build a life, long enough to raise 2 kids, long enough to believe that loyalty, real loyalty, still meant something once life got complicated. When I look back now, I can see the fault lines much earlier than I recognized them at the time. But that's how these stories always go. You don't notice the cracks while you're standing on solid ground. You notice them later when everything has already shifted. Andrew and I met in our mid-20s, back when we were both still hungry in the same way. Not the cute, motivational kind of hungry, the kind that keeps you up at night with a tight chest because you're afraid you'll never climb out of the life you were born into. He worked in commercial real estate, entry-level, eager, always talking about deals like they were just waiting to be picked up off the ground if he moved fast enough. I ran bookkeeping out of a spare bedroom. Mostly small business owners, landscapers, salon owners, a couple of food trucks. People who didn't need charisma. They needed accuracy. They needed someone who could look at a spreadsheet and see what was missing before the IRS did. Back then, we were equals. We split rent down the middle. We shared a used car. We built a life the way most people do, brick by brick, quietly, without applause. People forget that part when they rewrite history. We married before either of us had real money. No destination wedding, no designer anything, just my mom crying into a tissue, his friends cheering too loudly at the reception, and Andrew squeezing my hand like we were teammates. We bought a modest house in a safe neighborhood outside Charlotte. Then came our first child, Noah, then our second, Mia. Life became noisy and predictable. Homework on the kitchen counter, soccer cleats by the door, grocery lists stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Andrew's career took off. Mine stabilized. I told myself that was fine. Someone needed to be steady. Someone needed to hold the foundation while the rest of the structure expanded. I didn't realize that stability would later be rebranded as small. As Andrew climbed, I became infrastructure. Invisible, reliable, taken for granted. I handled the finances, the taxes, the savings, the oops, we forgot it's due tomorrow school payments, the insurance renewals, the dentist bills. Andrew became the face, the handshake, the smile, the person people remembered. At dinners, people asked him about markets and development projects and interest rates, like he was the only adult in the room. When they asked me what I did, Andrew answered for me. "Claire's brilliant with numbers," he'd say, smiling. "She keeps us organized." Always said with a grin. Always said in a way that ended the conversation. At first, I didn't push back. I told myself it didn't matter, that being useful was enough. I didn't understand how much power I was giving away by staying silent. The change didn't arrive like a bomb. It crept. It arrived disguised as jokes. "Claire's better with spreadsheets than people." Said lightly, laughed off by friends who didn't know what it cost to keep everything balanced. Then it arrived as decisions. Andrew refinancing the house because interest rates were favorable. Andrew moving investments into new LLCs because it was cleaner. Andrew taking meetings during family dinners because the client was important. And then, one day, Andrew looked at me like I was a helpful assistant and said, "You don't need to worry about the big picture anymore. I've got it." Each thing on its own sounded reasonable. Together, it was a pattern. I noticed. I just didn't panic. That was my first mistake. Margaret had always hovered on the edge of our marriage. Andrew's mother. Polite, controlled, never openly cruel. Her disapproval lived in precision. "Oh, bookkeeping? That's practical." Or, "Andrew always had bigger ambitions than staying local." Or my favorite, delivered like a compliment, "You're lucky Andrew's so driven. Some men get comfortable." When Andrew's father died, Margaret moved closer, emotionally and physically. She bought a condo 15 minutes away so she could help. She framed it as support, meals, advice, just checking in phone calls that always landed right when Andrew was home. But it wasn't support, it was influence. Margaret talked about legacy constantly, about protecting assets, about family wealth staying in the right hands, about not letting outsiders take what you've built. She introduced Andrew to her estate attorney, a man named Douglas Stowe, who wore expensive watches and spoke in a tone that made it sound like normal people didn't understand money. I wasn't invited to those meetings. I was summarized afterward, poorly. Whenever I asked questions, Andrew would smile and say, "It's all technical, Claire, you'd hate it." I had spent my entire adult life untangling technical finances for other people, but suddenly I was being treated like someone who couldn't understand her own, and I let it slide. That was my second mistake. Even the kids noticed changes before I fully accepted them. Andrew became distracted, absent in small ways that accumulated. He missed Noah's choir concert because a lender call ran long. He forgot Mia's orthodontist appointment and then acted offended when I reminded him. He stopped showing up to Saturday mornings at all. He'd come downstairs at 10, coffee in hand, phone already buzzing, and say, "We good?" Noah, 16 by then, started watching Andrew the way teenagers watch adults they no longer trust. Mia, 13, got quieter. Margaret, meanwhile, grew more present, picking them up from school, dropping off baked goods like she was running a campaign, offering opinions about colleges and the kind of people you should associate with. I told myself she was lonely. I told myself families close ranks after loss. I told myself nothing was wrong. The night everything shifted wasn't loud. No screaming, no slammed doors, just an envelope on the kitchen counter, addressed to Andrew. I opened it without thinking. I handled the mail, always had. Inside was a letter from an accounting firm I didn't recognize. Formal language, neutral tone. The kind of tone people use when they're doing something they don't want to feel responsible for. It referenced a family trust, one I had never heard of. It listed assets. The house, the brokerage account, a family operating account, and then near the bottom, like an afterthought, Matthew's bookkeeping services, contributing asset, my business. My stomach dropped so fast, it felt like a physical blow. I read it once, then again, then a third time. Only then did my hands start shaking. That evening, I asked Andrew about it. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I asked. He sighed, actually sighed, as if I were interrupting something important. "It's just restructuring," he said. "Mom thought it was sensible." I asked why my name wasn't on the trust. He didn't even look ashamed. That was what scared me. "It's easier this way," he said, like he was explaining a microwave. I asked how my business could be listed without my consent. He shrugged. "You benefit from it anyway." Something inside me went still. Not numb. Still, like a door quietly closing. I realized then that they didn't see me as a partner. I was a function, a resource, a line item, and resources don't get consulted. Resources get moved. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I nodded. I went upstairs, and I opened my laptop. Andrew thought I handled numbers. What he forgot was that I understood systems, how power moved, how paperwork protected some people and erased others. The first thing I did was stop reacting. No emotional conversations, no visible resistance. I became agreeable, supportive, interested. I asked questions gently. I listened more than I spoke. Margaret mistook my silence for submission. That was her mistake. When Margaret realized I wasn't making a fuss, she relaxed. And when she relaxed, she talked. She loved explaining things, loved feeling superior. Over coffee at my kitchen table, she told me, like she was doing me a favor, that trusts were the only sensible way to protect what Andrew had built. What Andrew has built, she said, emphasizing his name as if I were a tenant in my own life. She explained the structure, who controlled what, who could authorize distributions, who was protected, and who wasn't. She didn't use the word excluded. She didn't have to. It was written into the paperwork. And she never noticed that while she spoke, I was mapping vulnerabilities. Over the next year, I did 3 things. First, I documented everything. Every email, every calendar invite, every transfer, every meeting summary Andrew casually forwarded without thinking. I started forwarding copies to a separate email account and storing them in a folder I named Taxes 2021, because no one ever clicks on a folder called that. Second, I separated myself, quietly. I registered a new entity for my bookkeeping work, a clean LLC under a name that wasn't tied to our family brand. I moved only new clients. I didn't touch existing contracts because I didn't want to give anyone ammunition. I rebuilt my firm in parallel, legally, cleanly. Third, I waited, because people like Andrew don't stop. They escalate. There were moments when it was almost unbearable. Dinner parties where Andrew described our future like I wasn't sitting right there. Conversations where Noah watched me with a question in his eyes I couldn't answer yet. Nights where Mia would come into my room and ask, "Are we moving?" And I'd have to say, "I don't know," because the truth, the real truth, would have been too heavy to place on her shoulders. I started sleeping lightly, like my body knew something was hunting us. And every morning I got up, made breakfast, packed lunches, sent emails to clients, and smiled like nothing was happening. That's what survival looks like when you're not allowed to fall apart. There was one moment, about 6 months in, when I nearly exposed myself. Andrew had invited his colleague, Brent, and Brent's wife over for dinner. They were the kind of couple who said "we" when they meant Brent. Margaret was there too, of course. Andrew poured wine and started talking about relocation, not as an idea, as a done deal. "We're looking at Atlanta," he said. "Bigger market, better opportunities." I felt Noah's eyes snap to me. Mia went still. Brent's wife smiled too widely and said, "That sounds exciting. Fresh start." Margaret patted Andrew's arm like he was a boy getting a gold star. I could have ended it right there. I could have said, "We're not looking at anything. You've already moved our house into a trust without me." I could have watched their faces. But I didn't. I smiled, lifted my glass, and said, "That's a lot to think about." Andrew looked relieved. Margaret looked satisfied. Noah looked disappointed. That moment taught me something important. If I wanted to win, I couldn't win emotionally. I had to win structurally. The escalation arrived on our anniversary, 22 years. Andrew booked a table at a restaurant downtown. Expensive, dim, the kind of place where servers speak softly and call everyone sir and ma'am like it's a title. Margaret insisted on coming just for a toast. Andrew didn't object. That alone told me my position in the hierarchy. We sat at a round table that felt like a stage. Andrew ordered champagne. When it arrived, he stood. He raised his glass. He thanked Margaret for protecting the family's future. Not me, not the woman who had run the finances, built the stability, raised the children while he chased deals. Margaret smiled like she'd been crowned. And then Andrew announced he'd accepted a regional director role. which required relocating. He had already agreed, without asking me, without acknowledging my clients, without acknowledging my life. He turned to me, smiling, like this was a gift. "You'll love it," he said. "New city. New energy." And I smiled back. Not because I agreed, because I understood. He expected a reaction. He wanted me to be the emotional one, the irrational one, the obstacle. I refused to play that role. After dinner in the car, Mia's voice was quiet. "Did you know about that?" she asked. Andrew answered before I could. "Adults make decisions. You don't need to worry about it," Noah said. That's not what she asked. Andrew's jaw tightened. Margaret from the back seat said, "Noah, don't be disrespectful." Noah stared out the window. Mia looked at me like she was trying not to cry. That was when I knew this wasn't just about money. It was about erasing me in front of my own kids. About training them to see Andrew and Margaret as the decision makers and me as the background. And something in me hardened. That night, after Andrew fell asleep, I sent one email. To the Trust's compliance officer. Not to Douglas Stowe, the attorney. Not to Andrew. Not to Margaret. To the person whose job was to worry about risk. I wrote it calmly. I attached everything. The letter, the transfers, the meeting invitations I wasn't included in, the communications where Andrew referred to marital assets as family assets under his control, the conflict of interest emails between Margaret and Douglas that Andrew had accidentally forwarded to me months earlier. And then I closed my laptop and I went to sleep for the first full night in months. The fallout was slower than I expected, but heavier. 3 weeks passed, nothing. Andrew strutted around the house like he'd already won. Margaret started dropping hints about school districts in Atlanta. Then one afternoon, Andrew came home early. Not relaxed early, tight. His face was pale, his tie loosened, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump. He didn't even take off his shoes. He said, "Did you talk to anyone?" I blinked. "About what?" His eyes narrowed. "Work. The trust." "Anything." I kept my face neutral. "I don't know what you mean," I said. He stared at me like he was trying to decide whether I was lying. Then his phone rang. He stepped outside to answer it. Through the window, I watched him listen. His posture changed, shoulders dropping, head tilting, the body language of someone being informed that their power has limits. When he came back inside, he didn't look at me. He went upstairs and closed the door. 2 days later, he was suspended. Not fired immediately. Suspended. That detail matters, because suspension is what companies do when they don't want to admit you were as important as you thought you were. An internal audit had been triggered. Routine, they called it. But I'd spent long enough around professionals to know what routine looked like. This was panic dressed in policy. The audit uncovered undisclosed self-dealing, misrepresentation of marital assets, improper influence from a family member. And then, quietly, the rumors started. Because corporate news doesn't stay corporate. It leaks into dinners, into golf games, into whispered conversations at school fundraisers. Andrew's name became something people avoided. The first public crack happened at Noah's school. There was a fundraiser, one of those things where parents pretend they're not competitive while bidding against each other for silent auction baskets. Andrew used to love those events. He loved being seen, loved shaking hands. That night, he walked into the gymnasium like he still owned the room. And the room didn't respond. People smiled, polite smiles, tight smiles. No one moved toward him. No one touched his shoulder. No one pulled him into conversation. A man Andrew used to call Buddy glanced at him and then abruptly turned away like he hadn't seen him. Noah saw it. I saw Noah see it. And for the first time in months, my chest loosened slightly. Not because I enjoyed it, because I knew the machine was working. The relocation was canceled. Not announced, not discussed.
Simply removed. An email arrived to Andrew's work account. He forgot to log out of the family laptop, and the notification popped up on the screen like the universe was handing me proof. Due to ongoing review, the regional director transition is paused. Paused. A soft word for a hard fall. Then came the conference. Andrew had been scheduled to appear on a panel, Leadership in Modern Development. He'd bragged about it for weeks. One morning, I saw him staring at his phone so long it looked like he'd stopped blinking. "What?" I asked, even though I already knew. He swallowed. "They changed the lineup." He said it like it was a scheduling issue, but later that day, I received a text from a friend who worked in the industry. "Hey, is Andrew okay? Heard he got pulled from the panel." That's how public consequences work. Not with a headline, with a text message that feels like a hand on your throat. A lender froze a separate facility. That was the moment Andrew truly panicked, because business people can survive gossip. They can't survive cash flow problems. He started making phone calls in the kitchen, pacing, voice low, furious. He blamed everyone but himself. The company, the compliance team, idiots who don't understand. Margaret. He blamed Margaret too, but only when he thought no one could hear. "I told you this would complicate things," he hissed one night, believing I was asleep. Margaret replied, sharp and cold, "Don't you dare blame me, Andrew. This is your wife." That was the first time I heard her say "your wife" like it was an accusation. Margaret's attorney withdrew. Douglas Stowe sent a brief letter. Professional. Clean. The kind of letter that says, "I see the smoke and I'm leaving before the fire reaches me." The trust was frozen. Not dissolved. Frozen. Everything stopped moving. And suddenly, everyone wanted to speak to me. Not because they cared about me. Because when the men in the room fail, institutions look for the person who actually knows where the bodies are buried. And in finance, the bodies are always in the numbers. I didn't gloat. I answered questions, provided records, clarified timelines, handed over documentation like a librarian. When a compliance investigator asked why I hadn't raised concerns sooner, I said calmly, "I trusted my husband." A simple sentence. A sentence that sounded loyal. A sentence that, in context, was an indictment. Andrew tried to confront me, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, controlled way, like he thought he could still manage me. One evening, after the kids were in their rooms, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the wood like he was anchoring himself. "Claire," he said, voice low, "we need to be careful. This is bigger than us." I looked at him. "It became bigger than us when you moved our house into a trust without me." His eyes flashed. He leaned forward slightly. "I did what I had to do to protect our family." "Our family," I repeated. He nodded, emphatic. "Yes." "And where was I in that family?" I asked, quietly. He hesitated, just a beat, but that beat told me everything. He said, "You benefit." There it was again, not partner, beneficiary, like a child receiving an allowance. I stood up, collected my mug, and walked away. I didn't slam anything. I didn't raise my voice. I simply ended the conversation. That drove him crazier than any argument would have. Andrew stopped being invited to things. Networking events, industry dinners, golf outings. People were polite. They were also distant. At school, parents stopped asking him about work, stopped laughing at his jokes, stopped introducing him to new families. They didn't confront him. They didn't accuse him. They simply stepped back. That's the thing about social death. It's not an explosion. It's oxygen leaving the room. Margaret stopped calling, stopped advising, stopped existing in my life entirely. At first, I thought she was sulking. Then I realized she was strategizing. One Saturday, I went to a local cafe with Mia. She was quiet, stirring her hot chocolate like she was trying to erase something. At the next table, two women I recognized from our old social circle were talking. They weren't whispering, they were speaking in that deliberate, careful volume people use when they want you to hear without being able to accuse them of saying it. "I heard she sent something in," one woman said. "Claire?" the other asked. "Yeah. I mean, can you blame her?" Apparently, he set up some trust behind her back. The other woman made a sound like sympathy, then said, "Still, turning on your husband like that, that's harsh." Mia's spoon stopped. Her eyes flicked to me. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed even. "That's what happens," I told Mia, "when people confuse silence with weakness." She stared at me for a second. Then she nodded, slowly, like a teenager understanding something adult for the first time. Noah took longer. Teenage boys don't process betrayal with tears. They process it with distance. One night, he stood in the doorway of my room. He didn't sit down. He said, "Is Dad in trouble?" I didn't answer immediately because I wanted to choose the truth that wouldn't poison him. I said, "Your dad made decisions that weren't fair." Noah swallowed. "About you?" "Yes." Noah's jaw tightened. He hesitated. "Are we okay?" That question wasn't about money. It was about stability. It was about whether his world was going to split in half. I walked to him and put a hand on his arm. "We're okay," I said. "I made sure we're okay." He nodded once, hard, and walked away. But the next day, he hugged Mia in the kitchen before school, something he hadn't done in months. That was his way of saying he understood. The divorce began quietly. Andrew didn't file immediately. He tried to regain control first. He tried to negotiate, to reset, to suggest marriage counseling as if this was an emotional misunderstanding. But institutions had already moved. The trust was under review. Assets were flagged. Every attempt Andrew made to fix it created more documentation, more evidence, more problems for him. Eventually, he filed, not because he wanted freedom, because he wanted to cut his losses. The first mediation session felt surreal. We sat in a neutral office with beige walls and a bowl of mints on the table, like sweetness could soften betrayal. Andrew arrived in a suit that suddenly looked too sharp for him. He smiled at the mediator like he was still charming. Margaret wasn't there, but her presence was. In the posture of his shoulders, in the way he spoke about family assets as if family meant me and my mother. He tried to present me as unreasonable. He said, "Claire doesn't understand the complexity." I looked at the mediator and said calmly, "I understand it perfectly. That's why we're here." The mediator blinked. Andrew's smile tightened. He wasn't used to me speaking like that in public. In the weeks that followed, more consequences hit Andrew. Not dramatic ones, practical ones. A board invitation he'd been bragging about postponed indefinitely. A mentorship role at a local business school reassigned. A charity committee he chaired moving in a new direction. Every email was polite. Every email was final. People didn't accuse him publicly. They simply treated him as a liability. Margaret tried to re-enter my life once. Not with an apology, with a demand disguised as concern. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon while the kids were at school. She stood on my porch in a cream cardigan like she was auditioning for innocence. "Claire," she said, lips thin, "we need to talk." I didn't invite her in. She glanced past me into the hallway like she still had ownership. "This situation," she said, "is spiraling." I smiled, small. "It's being examined." Her eyes sharpened. "Andrew's career is at stake." I tilted my head. "Was my career at stake when you put my business into a trust without me?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then she tried a new angle. "What about the children?" she asked. I held her gaze. "They're watching." That was all I said. Margaret's face flushed with a kind of anger she couldn't perform politely. She stepped back, stiff, and said, "You're making a mistake. I didn't move. "No," I said. "I'm correcting one." She left without looking at me.
Andrew moved into a smaller rental. Not far at first, he wanted the illusion of continuity, wanted to still be around so he could claim he was present. But the kids didn't follow him the way he expected. Noah answered texts with single words. Mia stopped asking to visit. Andrew complained about it to anyone who would listen, but people don't sympathize with a man who got caught trying to erase his wife. They just nod and change the subject. My firm, my real firm, grew steadily, then sharply. Not because I marketed aggressively, because people talk, and when they hear a woman handled betrayal with calm precision, they start trusting her with their money. Clients referred clients. A local attorney asked if I could take over bookkeeping for several of his small business clients. A financial planner sent me a message. Heard you're meticulous, I need meticulous. I hired a part-time assistant, then a full-time one, then another.
Every new hire felt like a quiet counterweight to what Andrew had tried to do. He tried to make me smaller. I became larger. The final twist, the smaller one that made everything click, came through a school email. A message sent to all parents about a family legacy scholarship being offered by the Matthews Family Foundation. I stared at the screen. Matthews Family Foundation? We didn't have a foundation. I read the email again. The contact name at the bottom was Margaret, not Andrew.
Margaret had started positioning herself publicly as the family's benefactor while the trust was frozen and under review. It wasn't just financial control. It was reputation laundering. It was her trying to salvage public influence by framing herself as the generous matriarch. My hands went cold because that meant she wasn't done. That night, I didn't confront Andrew. I didn't call Margaret. I gathered more documentation, the email, the scholarship announcement, the foundation registration paperwork, which took about 5 minutes to pull because people like Margaret think secrecy is the same as security. It wasn't a real foundation. It was a shell, and it used language that implied control over assets still under court review. I forwarded it to the compliance investigator with one sentence. This appears to be a public representation of control over frozen assets. Then I went back to making dinner. The next week, Margaret's scholarship announcement disappeared from the school website. Quietly. No explanation. Parents asked questions. Administrators sent vague emails about revisions. Margaret didn't show up to pick the kids up anymore. She stopped attending school events altogether. She didn't call. She didn't text. Her silence wasn't peace. It was retreat. The divorce settlement came faster after that. Andrew's attorneys stopped posturing. Their language shifted. Less confident, more cautious. They began offering terms that actually resembled fairness, not because Andrew suddenly grew a conscience, because the risk profile had changed. He wasn't negotiating from power anymore. He was negotiating from damage control. The day we signed, the air felt heavy. We met in a conference room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. Andrew looked older, not in a dramatic way, in a small, painful way. His hair slightly thinner, his posture slightly smaller, his confidence not gone, but dented. He didn't look at me much. When he did, his eyes were searching, like he was still trying to find the version of me who would soften. He didn't find her. We signed. The trust was unwound. Assets reassigned properly. My business was legally protected. The house remained mine. Support was structured. Clean. Final. Andrew's pen scratched the paper like it resented the agreement. When it was done, he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. He stood, gathered his folder, and paused. He said, quietly, "You didn't have to do it like this." I looked at him. "I didn't," I said. "You did." He swallowed. And for the first time, the first and only time,
He looked like he understood the difference between control and consequence.
I stayed exactly where I was, grounded, solvent, visible. The kids stayed with me. They didn't need long speeches. They saw who remained steady. They saw who told the truth with actions instead of promises. And slowly, the shame that wasn't mine stopped trying to cling to me. Andrew's name faded from rooms. Margaret's influence evaporated, not with a bang, with absence. And that was the point. My name is Claire Matthews, and this was The Last Straw. If you enjoyed this story, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe.